Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brett Johnson, Senior Associate Director with the Northwestern University Transportation Center. Welcome to this May 2023 edition of the Sandhouse Rail Group. I just want to give you just some introductory information, and then I'm going to turn it over to Norm. First off, again, welcome. We'll be having a presentation by Bill and a Q&A afterwards. And so what I would ask everyone to do, if you have questions, is please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'll know who's sending the questions, so you don't need to state who you are. So send your questions and we'll get to them after the presentation. Norm, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brett. And thank you for joining us today. We're pleased to have Bill Vantuono, who is the, I forget the exact title, but he is the senior editor and I believe managing editor of Railway Age.
Editor-in-chief.
Editor-in-chief. There we go. I knew it was something like that.
One of those, yeah.
One of those. And Bill is a friend of Northwestern as well as a number of us personally. And we've asked, he has a very good grasp of what's going on in the railroad industry. And it's certainly an understatement to say there have been some things going on in the railroad industry in late 22 and early 23. And without further discussion, we all know Bill's background. Bill, please let us know what your thoughts are on the railroad industry of today.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Norm. I am most interested in fielding questions. And so I'm just going to make some general remarks, sort of give a snapshot of what's been going on in a very interesting year. What is that Chinese expression? May you live in interesting times. Oh my God, we are living in interesting times. But as I said, please fire away with questions, and I'll answer as many as I can. So. I think you have to go, when looking at the industry, mainly freight, but also on the passenger side, you really have to go back to when the great pandemic, when COVID hit, because that really accelerated a number of things that were going on, in our industry. As expected, freight traffic fell off. Passenger traffic plummeted to almost nothing because everybody was sequestered. And on that note, the passenger railroads are still recovering from the pandemic, with ridership coming back, but coming back in some markets, quickly, and other markets not so much. The challenge on the passenger side has been to adjust schedules for the new, pardon the expression, Norm, the new normal. Okay, the new norm, which is more people working flexible schedules, working out of the house, if not full time, then maybe. Coming into the office fewer than 5 days a week, and at different times. So I think the commuter, at least for the commuter railroads that are traditionally been operated on morning and evening peaks with limited service in the off hours, they've had to make adjustments. And I know Metra in Chicago has, the T in Boston. NJ Transit to a certain extent, Metro North, Long Island Railroad, some of the big commuter carriers in the country. But it's not always so easy to make those schedule adjustments. I would imagine it would be maybe a bit harder for Metra to adjust, because Metra, as we know, is a very heavily trafficked, shared service, shared corridors with freight and passengers. So if you want to run more passenger trains in the traditional in quotes, off-peak hours, you've got to work with the freight carriers to see what see what can be done. But a bigger, I think, a bigger challenge that the passenger rail industry is facing, and this is not just regional commuter service, it's also Amtrak and the transit services, rapid transit light rail, is that the COVID-19 relief funding is winding down, and it's going to be, I think it's within a year or two, at least as it currently is scheduled to run out. I think what's remaining is about $2.5 billion, which, you know, when you spread it out among many agencies in the country, it's not a whole lot of money. But now I understand that, and this is something I just learned this morning, that in discussions between the White House and the Congress for raising the debt ceiling, at least the House is saying, well, you know, you're going to have to, if you want us to raise the debt ceiling, you're going to have to give something back. You're going to have to cut somewhere, okay? And one of the cuts that has been proposed, and I'm not sure how far it'll get, is actually cutting off the COVID relief funding immediately, or at least winding it down a lot faster than it was originally planned. So, you know, I've read and heard expressions like, you know, the fiscal crisis, falling off the edge of a cliff, so on and so forth. Norm, maybe perhaps later on, you could give us a picture of what's happening in the Chicago region with Metra. I know you know, Jim Derwinski, of course, is dealing with that, as are all the CEOs, the ones that I've spoken with, Kevin Corbett at NJ Transit, Catherine Rinaldi at the Long Island Railroad, Metro North. So that's one crisis. Last year, at the end of last year, we had a resolution to a very contentious national bargaining session, okay, with the 12 main unions on the class one railroads, and it reached a point where the White House had to intervene. Presidential Emergency Board was formed, and it actually went to Congress, and we came this close to a strike. But we were able to avert it. Labor got most of what they wanted, but not everything. I think they realized that they were at a point, well, you know, this is the best we can do. But on a positive note, from that, one of the things that labor had asked for, which they didn't get at the outset, was paid sick leave, which would be over and above the regularly, you know, the negotiated paid time off. That's part of a labor agreement. I'm sure most of you know this, but paid time off is when it's part of your contract. That includes sick days, vacation, personal days, and it can be quite restrictive. And so labor was asking for, in addition to that, paid sick leave, which to most of us, at least those of us who don't work for the railroad, you know, that's something we kind of take for granted. Well, at the end of last year, CSX hired a brand new CEO, Joe Hinrichs, who I've gotten to know quite well over the past few months, and he comes from Ford Motor Company. Joe is when he was running Ford and the, you know, president really, and running the industrial part of it, the manufacturing part, he was a railroad customer, so he understands. You know, he understands a lot about this industry. He has a very fine chief operating officer, Jamie Boychuk, who comes from the CP in Canada. And Joe and Jamie and their labor people got together and said, look, why don't we do something about this? Why can't we offer our employees paid sick leave? I think they thought that it would improve relations. Joe, as I know him to be, is he cares really about his employees. He cares about service, about customer service, and from what I've been able to ascertain from talking with people at CSX, the employees just really respect him. He's outgoing, he's friendly, he's approachable. He's just regular Joe, okay, to coin a phrase. So Joe and his team got together and they went to one of the unions, which is traditionally, I believe it was the BMW ED, which has traditionally been one of the toughest to work with. And they proposed this, and the union took it up on them, and they were able to hammer out an agreement for paid sick leave. I think it was either 7 or 10 days. I don't remember exactly how many. But what we saw at Railway Age was that eventually, very quickly, the other railroads, fell into step with CSX, and one by one, you had BNSF, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, going so on and so forth, taking the same approach. And of course, with a lot of negotiations, with a lot of unions to negotiate with, it wasn't a blanket policy. Every agreement had to be for paid sick leave, had to be hammered out on an individual basis with the individual unions within each railroad. Separate from the national agreement that was struck, and they've been very successful. Hardly a week doesn't go by when we don't get word, officially or unofficially, that a particular union hasn't signed on with paid sick leave. So that's a very positive step. I think. As we all know, our railroad workers, our unionized employees, the people out there running the trains, the conductors, the engineers, the track workers, the signalmen, brakemen, switchmen, shop workers, you name it. These people, pardon my French, but they work their asses off. Okay, and yes, they're well paid and their benefits are really good, but I think it's a good step that this industry has taken to acknowledge that paid sick leave is something that they deserve. So that's a good note. On I don't know if I call it a negative note, but on a very problematic note. In the middle of all this, then we had that awful derailment on the Norfolk Southern. In East Palestine, where there was a hotbox journal on a covered hopper burned off, and it caused several dozen cars to derail. And one of them happened to be a tank car carrying an older tank car that was carrying vinyl chloride. That breached, set off a fire. Following that, the railroad took the safest, but of all the options to take care of the spill, none of them were really great, or none of them were an ideal solution. But the best one was actually to vent the rest of dig a trench, vent the rest of the vinyl chloride, and ignite it, and just burn it off. From that, we have entered into, on top of all the safety and service failure scrutiny that has been placed on this industry, in the freight rail industry, by the Surface Transportation Board and by others, including Capitol Hill. We now have this whole event turned into it has been very, very politicized. And I'm watching this going on, and unfortunately, it's but perhaps not unpredictably, it's been a an opportunity for opportunists to blame the industry and call it unsafe, and everybody's piling on, and the media, the general media, has picked up on this, and most of these folks in the media don't really have a clue how railroads operate, what's involved, and the misinformation that I've seen in the general press and the national media. I just shake my head. I just don't believe some of this stuff. This is almost funny, but it's really not. There was a headline in a news story. It was a news report on some local station that said a CSX freight train derailed while trying to swerve around a truck that had gotten stuck on a crossing. Folks, I don't know what to say about that kind of stuff. I called the station and I asked to speak to the newsroom, and I told them, I said, "Are you people kidding me?" I said, "Trains don't swerve; they're on a fixed guideway." They hung up on me. So that's what we've been dealing with. I would have to say that Alan Shaw, the CEO, president CEO of Norfolk Southern, I think he's perhaps the most recognized Class 1 CEO in the country. He's been on national media numerous times. He's really been under fire, and but I think that he's making, and Norfolk Southern is making, a very serious concerted effort to do right by the township, by East Palestine, in terms of compensating the townspeople for their losses, whether it be real estate value, being right at the forefront of environmental testing, so on and so forth. They're doing soil remediation. In fact, the second main line in that section, that's the NS main, the former Pennsylvania Railroad main that goes from basically from Philadelphia to all the way out to Chicago. That has the second mainline track where they were doing the soil remediation is finally back in service. I think I honestly think, and I tend to see the good in people. I think the Norfolk Southern has been very sincere. Their most recent earnings report for the first quarter, actually they took a financial charge of almost $500 million in costs related to this derailment. So, we'll see where that goes. There is pending legislation now in the Senate. It passed out of committee. It's called the Rail Safety Act. It's going to be brought before the entire Senate, and there may be some changes to it, some amendments. Is it going to pass? Unknown at this point. It needs 60 votes to pass the Senate, and then it would have to be reconciled with a House bill. There's some speculation that the House is just going to take the Senate bill, whatever it is, and just adopt it in whole and just rubber stamp it, and then send it to the president for signage. Now, there's quite a few provisions in this bill which really are, in the long run, could be quite harmful, and some of the stuff just doesn't make sense. Actually, to me, a lot of it doesn't make sense. I'll give you an example. The provision for increasing the number of hot HBDs, hot bearing detectors, or hot box detectors, which the railroads have, since East Palestine and before that, had been actually doing on their own. HBD installation has always been voluntary. It's never been regulated. The temperature thresholds at which these detectors are set has always been up, and the distance between detectors has always been determined by the railroad based on its operations, length of length of a particular line segment, grades, curves, so on and so forth, and regulating it and prescribing a minimum distance doesn't really make sense. There was, as far as I can tell, there was nothing in the bill that, and nor would it have to be, that addressed, as far as HBDs are concerned, the thing that would really prevent something like this from happening again, and that's called trending. And most of the railroads are already doing this. BNSF, for example, is widespread with this. And trending basically is you have hotbox detectors talking to each other, all right, and relaying data back to the central office or the dispatch or the trouble desk, whatever it might be, and that information being relayed in real time to the crew. So if you have an HBD picking up a slight temperature variation in one bearing, and then at the next bearing it gets a little higher, and the next bearing, next detector, it gets a little higher. Essentially, in simple terms, it's going to set off an alarm. Say, okay, you've got trouble here. There's a bearing heating up. It's on this axle, on this wheel, on this car, and it's time to stop the train, set the car out, or whatever mitigation action needs to be done. Interesting statistic. Last year, Norfolk Southern, on its entire system throughout the year 2022, registered 2 billion, I'll repeat that, 2 billion HBD readings, okay? Of those readings, only less than 300 or 400 indicated that that there was a trouble with a bearing, that it needed to be that needed to be addressed. And of all of that, there were no derailments, none caused by a burn off. On that particular line segment in East Palestine, there was not trending, and it was just I guess you'd call it a perfect storm, because the bearings started to heat up rather rapidly. And by the time it reached one detector where the temperature threshold, the last detector before the derailment, where the temperature was enough to tell the crew, stop the train, it was too late, burned off, and we know what happened. But going back to that 2 billion number of readings and all the mitigated failures that took place last year, the chances of something like East Palestine happening were literally 1 in a million, but it happened. All right, and you can say all you want about that. You can publish those numbers. The AAR can say, well, 99.9% of hazmat reaches its destination without incident. Most derailments of hazmat spills are small, at low speed, occur in a yard. You can say that all you want. It's not going to help the people of East Palestine, nor are the politicians going to say, oh, well, yes, that's true, so we'll, we understand, and we'll we're not going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. So where the Rail Safety Act goes is unclear at this point. The AAR and the Short Line Association have some concerns. Mostly they've got to, I guess, play the what's the word I'm looking for? The respectful servant, and say, yes, we agree. I mean, who doesn't want who doesn't want to improve safety? No one does. But there are some serious concerns there with what the long-term implications might be. In my opinion, one of them would be that if you got to put extra money now into hot bearing detectors, increasing their number, increasing the technology, that could potentially take away from investment in more modern technologies, like onboard real-time detection of faults, which is available, okay? And feeding all that data into the PTC network. You know, HBDs are great; they work beautifully, but there's newer technology that could, over time, supplement or replace it. And putting money into a technology that's been around for generations now, I'm not sure how far back the first ones go, probably the 1960s, I would imagine, or the 70s, could take away from investment in newer technologies. The other problematic area with HBDs is this requirement that a commuter railroad, which owns its own tracks and hosts freight trains, would have to install hot bearing detectors at its own cost. The APTA and the Commuter Rail Coalition, of which Metra's Jim Derwinski is a founding member, they're heavily involved in tamping that down. It's a cost which they believe should be borne by the freight railroads, not the commuter railroads. And they have a very serious, and I think they have a very valid point, because if you look at a commuter rail operation, you have the same fleet of captive cars that operate, compared to a freight car and interchange service, a very short distance between the same 2 points every day. You have the same people inspecting that equipment at each end before the run. So you have the inspectors who know the equipment. Hot bearing detectors really, honestly, aren't all that necessary. So why should the commuter railroad be forced to pay for hot bearing detectors that it doesn't need? Again, a very valid point. So that's pretty much a snapshot of what's happening in this industry. There's a lot going on at the same time, and it's tough to keep track of all the stuff, but we're managing somehow. It makes for interesting times. From a journalism standpoint, it makes there's always we're always busy, and hopefully we're doing a good job covering what's going on. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Please fire away.
So we have a question coming in, but I want to,
Yes.
before people keep on typing and hit go, I want to try something else to maybe make this a little bit more interactive, which I think might be more helpful rather than me reading all the questions. So I'm going to ask the attendees, and on your Zoom, the bottom, you'll see there's a place where you can say, raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I should see your hand pop up on my list, and then I can allow you to talk. So let's see who's raised their hand. So I'm going to try this with Michael Blazek.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. Bill, I appreciate your insights on the industry. To me, the biggest issue for the freight rail industry going forward is kind of a combination of two things. One is the ongoing deindustrialization of the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada.
Yes.
Which is eroding the traffic base steadily. And the service issues that have resulted from PSR, which I think everybody agrees are out there and are accelerating the trend to the extent as industry stays in business in the United States, it accelerates the trends toward truck. At some point, my concern is this is going to begin constricting the railroad industry's access to capital. And I wanted to ask you, do you share these concerns, and what do you see from your perspective? To me, it's a real existential question for the railroad industry as to how it's going to survive on intermodal and pockets of traffic that really don't have much of an alternative, chemicals being the big one.
I think you have a very valid point, Mike. And access to capital. Well, if the investors aren't seeing any growth, but I'll just add a comment here that how many investors are really thinking long-term growth? Not too many. I think they're more interested in this. What can you do for me this next quarter? But I think over the long term, it could compromise access to capital. In terms of PSR, the original intent of PSR, as envisioned by people like Hunter Harrison and others, who worked with him. I think the concept of PSR has been. I'm trying to think of a polite way of putting this. Has been bastardized or misconstrued. PSR is not necessarily about running 3-mile long trains, okay, and shutting down yards and cutting employees. It's really about doing the most with what you have, and I guess maximizing assets, or shedding excess assets, doing more with less, but not to the point. Not to the point where you're running trains that are so incredibly long that the chance for an operational error, like assembling a consist where you've got lightweight cars up front and heavy and loaded cars in the back, the back of the train, which sets up all kinds of awful dynamic forces. Heck, if I do that on my model railroad next door, I'll have cars popping off the track in the middle of the train. I got to balance that. So, but so I think it's been misconstrued. I think one thing that Hunter Harrison did, and I asked him this. It wasn't too long before he died, when he was at CSX. Hunter went in and just turned CSX upside down and shook it violently. And I asked him, I said, "Do you think you went too fast and too far on a few things?" And he said, "Well, yeah." In his husky southern, "Yeah, well, I think so. I think I did, Bill." And and I think, why did he do that? Why was he so quick to make so many radical changes that really caused a big service meltdown at CSX? And then the other railroads followed suit: Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific. Why did he do that? Well, I think he knew his days were numbered, and he was trying to accomplish as much as he could before he passed on. But on an encouraging note, we do see some efforts to limit train size. I think CN is now cutting down a bit on train length. Norfolk Southern, Canadian Pacific, Kansas City, and that was the other thing which I don't ask me why I passed over it, but that's a really significant event, the merger of the CP and the KCS. CP is committed to I think reasonable train lengths, but one of the things that Mike, to get to your point, Mike, of manufacturing, one of the things that we're seeing is what's called nearshoring, and that is some of the manufacturing base being shifted from the Pacific Rim, namely China, back to North America. Now, granted, most of that manufacturing has been coming back being relocated in Mexico. And on the rail side, there's almost all freight car manufacturing has been shifted to Mexico. But and as we know, with the maquiladoras and some of the automotive plants, a lot of that manufacturing takes place in Mexico. But for CPKC, that's really, that's something that they say that they believe that they can leverage with single line service. So yeah, would we like to see more manufacturing in the United States? Of course we would. Could that eventually occur? Will nearshoring include the U.S. and Canada? As now it's mostly concentrated on Mexico. Don't know. I certainly hope so. But operations like CPKC, and also now with CN partnering with Union Pacific and Ferromex to offer competitive intermodal service with CPKC, that's good, because we know competition is a good thing.
Thanks very much.
Bill, there are 4 questions that came in that I will read. And the only raised hand I saw so far was Michael. If someone else did raise a hand, please re-raise it. So from Richard Gill, he says, putting aside the
It's a tough
There we
word,
go.
politicization, politics.
No, I'm just saying the wrong word. I'm reading the wrong word. So let's putting aside the political ramifications of railroad safety, are there changes in freight train operation that railroads are making following the East Palestine wreck? This could include train length, car placement, braking systems, communications, and others.
Yes, as I mentioned before, some of the railroads, at least Norfolk Southern, is shifting its operations. They're trying to run shorter, not that much shorter, but shorter trains. There's an increasing use of distributed power. I don't think the East Palestine train had distributed power. Distributed power is very beneficial in terms of safety, because if you place power within the consist, head end, mid train, in maybe 1 or more locations, and then at the rear, what we used to call pushers or helper units, that can balance the in-train dynamic forces, the buff and the draft, and also that enables brake propagation from various points in the train. With just a head end power and an end of train device as a telemetry and braking, when the brakes are applied, you have the brake propagation coming from both ends of the train, meeting somewhere in the center, which happens pretty quickly, but with distributed power only makes that better. And that's why one reason why the railroads, with the improvements in the traditional air brake, which is not 19th century technology, by the way, that's another thing that really, I shake my head at that when that's used. Really, the railroads found that through a lot of research that ECP braking, electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, really don't offer any really tangible safety benefit over the most advanced versions of traditional air brakes. Not only that, the cost of implementing, the cost and time to implement ECP brakes across the interchange fleet is almost prohibitive, because you have think of a train makeup in a yard. You have to connect a glad hand and an electronic device, so that can essentially double the time it takes to make up a train. I remember writing about ECP brakes back in the 90s, and the FRA even had a plan to go from unit coal trains to auto rack trains to intermodal to general interchange. Never happened. It just got the traditional braking technology improved. Other technologies which are really helping to improve safety, and they're based on, a lot of them are based on, here's a term that we've heard now, which is supposed to be very dangerous: artificial intelligence. Well, the kinds of artificial intelligence that the railroads are using are actually quite effective, supplementing the human eye for inspection. For example, the inspection portals with using machine vision, where a revenue train can pass through at track speed, and an array of cameras. Duos Technologies is one of the companies that makes these portals, and the CSX is using them. CN is using them. They look at every single component on a rail car: the wheels, the axles, the bearings, the brake rigging, springs, side bearings, whatever, and it can pick up flaws and identify them with far more accuracy than a simple visual inspection can do. There's actually one being deployed on the Northeast Corridor, on what's called the High Line between Newark, New Jersey, my hometown, and New York, and that will be able to take readings like this at trains passing through at well over 100 miles an hour, and relay that information in real time. The other thing is these inspection cars, which CSX, track inspection cars, which CSX and CN and others are using. And these are specially equipped box cars that operate in revenue service trains, and they're able to take track geometry and rail flaw readings, other types of readings, in real time as the train is in operation. That cuts down on inspection time. It accelerates the opportunity for getting a crew out to correct the flaw, whatever it is. The other thing is real-time onboard tracking, telematics. There's the Rail Pulse Consortium, which involves Trinity, Greenbrier, Rail Link, Genesee, Wyoming, and others. There's TTX is now installing tracking devices. They're made by a company called Nexiot on auto rack cars and on T-box box cars. These are able to track shipments in real time and relay that information to the railroad and to the customer. And this is the kind of service that the railroads have to provide if they're going to satisfy provide that level of service for their customers that will compel the people to ship by train instead of by truck. Real-time tracking and health monitoring. It's available. It can be expanded to include all kinds of sensors that would detect the shifted load, for example, a flat wheel, okay, other things that might be going on, an open hatch on a tank car. Trinity offers this. Now it's in kind of the pseudo-experimental stage. But I think it's a matter of one big customer signing on and deploying this across the fleet, and then it'll spread. So those are the kinds of technologies we're seeing. PTC, an unfunded mandate. Hopefully, I think the railroads are now looking at what's called PTC 2.0, in which you use the bandwidth that's available on the PTC platform, which is now used basically for safety, for enforcement of speed restrictions, worker protection, so on and so forth. Leveraging that bandwidth to add more functionality to it. It's all geared towards safety. So, I think the East Palestine probably has accelerated some of these initiatives. It's too bad that we need need a disaster like that to get some of us off our collective butts and get this stuff moving. But the technology's out there, and it's underway. It's underway.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to invite Gary Kaufman to ask his question, then I'm going to go back to the written questions. So Gary, you should be unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. So I'm the CFO for Wytronics, and
Yes. Hi.
I'm only going to mention one thing quickly, just because you were going through a series of onboard technologies and other technologies are there, and we are an onboard technology provider for the industry. So
Right.
but I won't do any further plug beyond that. I did have a question. So you had made a comment which I couldn't agree with more, which was in the context of the East Palestine incident and everything going on, that the AAR having any kind of a voice and that, was just going to get lost in the shuffle, right? Yeah. I think from I'm relatively new to the industry and to the company, but I think speaking for our team, outside of the crisis mode or that time period, I think that we feel that the AAR has an opportunity to do more marketing and promotion for the industry that maybe would have, helped to get ahead of, here, or just generally speaking to the virtues of rail versus trucking and so on and so forth. So we're just kind of curious, outside of the crisis mode, if you have a perspective on that.
I do, and this goes back many years. I've been with publication now 31 years, just about. And I remember when Ed Hamburger came on board as the CEO of the AAR, and he said the railroad industry was the greatest story never told. The industry needs to do a lot more in terms of public outreach, public knowledge, public and media understanding of railroads. The AAR at one point did have a program like that, an advertising program, for lack of a better word, but it was really targeted towards selected markets. Okay, they wanted to reach the Beltway crowd. Okay. And maybe some other markets, and it wasn't a national, because, as you know, a national media campaign would be very, very costly, and I'm not so sure if the industry, or if the AAR specifically sees the benefit or the return on investment. Spending millions and millions of dollars on this stuff, is it going to reach the right audience? The railroads and the AAR too, and the Short Line Association and others, APTA, if you look at their websites, there's a lot of public information on there. There's a lot of good stuff on there. Some of that we'll pick up and publish. So there is a concerted effort for the railroads to get their message, to get their accomplishments out to the public through social media, through their website. They all have Twitter account. In fact, we used to get a lot of press releases. Now we get Twitter feeds and try to cull from that. Those are targeted toward, of course, their specific operating territories. There's a lot of good stuff out there, a lot of good information. Is it reaching the right people? I don't know. I guess you'd have to talk to the railroad communications people to see, get their Google Analytics or whatever they use to track their responses. There's a lot of community outreach. Railroads have gotten very, I think they've gotten more proactive with working with communities on special programs, educational institutions, working with first responders, Operation Lifesaver. So there is a concerted effort. Is it enough? Um, Maybe not. Is it a national program? No, it's not national. Um, so unfortunately, any effort that the railroads, either individually or collectively, make on getting their message out and trying to educate the public, unfortunately, too often it is overshadowed by the news stories of of hell and disaster, and the politicians piling on to their for their to suit their own purposes. So, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying. We shouldn't keep going on it.
All right, Bill, let me turn to a couple of related questions, and thank you, Gary. But the two questions come from Harry Zander and Richard Jorgensen. I'm going to read them back to back. They're similar. First is the suburban challenge to the STB CPKC approval viable? And related, what are your views of the merger, particularly in light of the lawsuits filed by the towns around Chicago? Are more conditions to be added possibly?
It's possible. The STB has 7 years of oversight over the merger, which is actually kind of unusual. To my knowledge, 5 years is customary. 3 to 5 years, 7 years. CP agreed to. Yeah, okay, fine. We're fine with 7 years. Will these lawsuits go anywhere? I don't think they're going to make a huge dent. You might see some more conditions. I think I think overall, my personal perspective is that this merger with providing single line service, I think it's a positive step, because single line service is always better than interline service. At least from past experience, it teaches us that. I think the management at the CPKC is quite dedicated to doing right in the communities. I know a lot of these folks personally, people like Keith Creel and John Orr, and they're good people. They really are. I'm not saying that, just because some of them I know more intimately. They're really good people. What was the second part of the question? I got lost. Whoop, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the gist of the both. Was is there anything that is the suburban challenge, the Chicago, area towns and suburban towns, are their challenges viable? I think you just answered that. And are more conditions likely to be added? And I think you answered that as well.
Yeah, just to reiterate, with single line service, you've got a transnational railway from Canada to the U.S. to Mexico. And on the passenger side, and I think that's the big Norm. I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the biggest concern in the Chicago region is how will the additional trains, and I think there's a lot fewer additional trains on certain lines than that has been said publicly. Much fewer. How will that impact the commuter rail operations? And from what we've seen at CPKC, I think bolstered by the fact that they're working now with Amtrak on instituting some new Amtrak services, getting some good cooperation there. I think CPKC will work, and I tend to be an optimist. I think they'll work collaboratively with Metra and some of the other territories that they operate to make sure that the passenger services are not compromised. But you've got to think of it this way: if more freight is going to be moved, okay, during the coming years, in the next 10, 15 years, would you rather see it on a highway or on a local road in a truck, or would you rather see it on a train on a fixed guideway, as safe as it can be? I'd rather see it on a train.
Well, let's steer your optimism toward another question from Greg Hanna. Do you think the recent labor actions around paid time off and the ongoing labor shortage nationwide will soften the historically difficult relationship between rail management and rail labor?
Yes, that's already happening. Now, granted, the railroads still have a lot of work to do in terms of not so much for their employees that they've got, okay, giving them the paid sick leave, working with them on improving their quality of life, okay. But the real problem, the real challenge, people don't like to say problem anymore, they say challenge. Well, you don't solve challenges, you solve problems. The real problem is retention of new employees. I understand that recruiting is not necessarily an issue, because railroads offer very attractive pay, very attractive benefits. But today's younger people, they're interested, I think, just as much in quality of life. All right. And to them, a lot of them, well, I'm going to be on call. This railroad operates 24 hours a day. Some of them will be recruited, and they'll get the whole spiel. Well, we operate 24 hours a day. You're going to be on call, this to that. And they'll say, yeah, I can handle that. Yeah, sure, no problem. But they get their training, the railroad invests their time and money into training them, getting them out. But once they're in the job for a few months, they're saying, oh my God, I didn't know it was going to be like this. And off they go. That's been the problem. How do you change that? Well, if a railroad has been following, the railroad industry has been following the means of crewing for generations, where you're on call, there's seniority, so on and so forth. That's not going to change overnight, so they are looking at how to adjust their operations to satisfy the needs of or the wants of the younger generation. Some of the old heads will say, those people are just lazy, they don't want to work. Well, maybe not so much, so we'll see where that goes. But to your point, things are improving, not dramatically, but in steps, incrementally.
Okay, John Plant raised his hand and also wrote in. I'm going to ask him to ask directly.
Okay, thank you. Just two questions. The first one is, you spoke earlier about braking trains from both ends. The braking goes from front to back and back to front
Yes.
between the units, whether they're the head unit or DPUs or whatever. My experience with that and the derailments really goes back to the Christmas train for CTA, where we put a flat car between two married pairs of motor units, and we derailed it twice in the same spot on a curve.
Oh God. Okay.
3 years. So what I'm a little confused about if you're braking, if you have a pusher on the back end and you're braking forward and in reverse, doesn't that kind of, increase the possibility of derailing those albeit empty cars?
Well, probably not, because it doesn't, what you want, the ideal situation is that all the brakes in the entire train will set up and be applied at the same time. Okay. With braking that is initiated by the end of train device, okay, or by a helper locomotive. More often than not, an end of train device. We're not talking about a very long propagation time, not 10, 20, 30 seconds. You might be talking a brake propagation time, if it's coming from both ends, maybe 3 to 5 seconds. In ideal conditions. This is, it's going to take longer in cold weather. Okay, this is one reason why the CP is limiting train length in Canada in very, very cold conditions. So the brake propagation will be fairly even throughout the train. But it's not just braking. I think it's also a matter of skillful train handling on the part of the locomotive engineer, and there are other technologies to assist with that train handling. One is, for example, New York Air Brake, their leader system, which is deployed widespread. That's locomotive engineer assist display event recorder. I've been in the cab of a Norfolk Southern train using leader, and it gives in real time a readout of what the train is doing, the curvature, the grades, the territory, and it will not force the engineer to do something. It'll suggest this is what you should be doing, and it's very effective. So I guess on the CTA, what was it? Was a single flat car in between two married pairs? Was a flat car? Was it cut into the braking system on the train? Because they're totally incompatible. A transit brake, which is ECP, and a flat car. And it was a flat car, just an idler car without any air connections.
No, actually, it was the car in which Santa rode in his.
Oh, poor Santa. Jeez.
Oh, well, at least he was covered by workers' comp.
Ah, okay. Well, that's.
And my second question is, communities' biggest beef with longer trains, and even in some communities just with what we used to think of as standard length freight trains, is the blockage of rail crossings.
Right.
They always point to the increased response time for emergency responders, the general inconvenience. Lately, there have been at least two that I know of technological attempts to at least inform communities and especially emergency responder communication centers of where the trains are and how long they expect it to take to pass. What do you think of those kinds of technologies, and how useful do you think they are overall?
Well, I think they're very useful. Their deployment is not widespread, but I think with all the pressures now put on the railroads by communities, and I think that railroads realize that this technology has to ramp up more. there's, there are, understandably, there are some security concerns the railroads have. Well, we don't want to, we don't want to let everybody know what we're moving through the community. We're a common carrier. We don't have to report that. Well, if there's a secure, and I understand those concerns, if there's a secure way of communicating that information to the people that need to know, okay, the first responders, police, fire, emergency ambulances, so on and so forth. And there is a way to communicate that information. It's just the networks have to be established. The railroads have to work with the various departments to get that information out in real time. It can be done. And I think, the railroads now are in a position where they can't just take their time to do that. They've got to ramp that effort up. But, if they get this stuff going, of course, it'll be very effective. And try not to block the crossings when you can.
Norm and Bill, we don't have any additional questions coming in, so I want to turn it over to Norm, who may have a comment or a question, and invite you to wrap up the session, Norm, after any final comments.
Okay. Number one, and this is not related to the East Palestine accident itself, but lately with regard to derailments in total, I want to make that very specific. And with derailments in total, excluding the NS situation in Ohio, there's been a lot of focus on how the trains are built, how the consists are built, and that you want to have the weight proportional. I've been hearing a lot of this from my contacts who are on the operating side of the industry. So, Bill, I just want to add that one is the makeup of the train and where the weight is or isn't is also an issue that I understand the railroads are really starting to look at even more carefully and emphasize more carefully with long trains.
Yeah, there is I think the FRA did recently issue a safety advisory on that very matter. And just real quick, I think, I've heard that in some instances, the trains were not made up properly because the yard master or whoever felt pressured to get the train out of the yard, so the proper care wasn't taken in some instances. So that's one factor, I think. Take the pressure off. Hey, we got to get this right. We can't be putting empties in front of loads. Basic physics.
To address some of the questions that you raised, yes, Metra is dependent on working with its carrier partners, but post-pandemic and even leading up to even earlier than that, Metra has been having very good cooperation with adding midday trains, particularly on the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific Northwest line. CP has, we are now having full service on the lines that CP runs. All the midday trains have been restored that were taken off in the pandemic. And some of the other lines, CN has permitted some additional trains on Saturday for moving people to some of the areas in the southwestern part of Cook County. So just in general, I would say, in my experience, at least with Metra, we're having the best general cooperation in terms of adding trains and moving schedules around to adapt to the new normal. There are more trains now on the UP Northwest line. That's the line through Des Plaines, Arlington Heights, out to Crystal Lake and Harvard. And because of the construction on the Kennedy Expressway, which is the main arterial street in from the north and northwest suburbs, expressway, I should say. And on some lines, we're seeing high single digit, and in a couple of cases on some of the lower riding lines, double digits increase in traffic because of the Kennedy construction. So I think there's very good relationships. The main issue that I think that is in the data collection is to see that CPKC continues to dispatch the trains in the rush hour in particular, and not be blocking stations with freight trains so people can't get to the,
Right.
so I think that's the only issue out there that I think we need to see what's going to develop.
Where do you, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bill.
Just in terms of the passenger Metra, and this would apply to just about any agency, but looking specifically at Metra, what has been the balance of passenger of ridership throughout the day? Is it more even, or has peak period ridership come down a little bit, and off peak come up a bit, where it's more balanced throughout the day, and weekends too?
Weekends, we are approaching 100% of pre-pandemic riding, and in some weekends it's exceeded pre-pandemic riding because of the young people wanting to go to the events in downtown Chicago. And there's a number of events coming up this summer that I think everybody's really optimistic about the number of riders who are going to be using the train to get downtown, again, because of all the highway construction. Metra reported a couple months ago that the midday riding on average had increased about 25%. So that
Wow.
the rush hours are down, the midday is up. John Plant happens to live on the UP North line, which has been an amazing story. That's the perception of that line, as it serves the leafy, wealthy northern suburbs along the lakefront. Well, it's had one of the highest percentage retention ridership throughout the pandemic because people did not realize how many essential workers live on the line, and the minority populations in Evanston, Highwood, Waukegan, North Chicago, Zion, and even to a certain extent in Kenosha. So that's going to drive me to another point, and I'll come back to this. One of the things now that the RTA in Chicago, which is the oversight for CTA, Metra, and Pace Suburban Bus, is what is the social value of transit. That is becoming a key measurement step. And how does this maintain equity in terms of access to things across the board? Because there are many people in Chicago and in some of the suburbs who do not have automobiles, believe it or not. They are highly dependent on transit. And we've seen that especially on the UP North line, which has been an eye-opener to everybody. So the other area where I think the industry is going is looking to state funding to help. And of course, the states have their own problems, which makes this a very interesting discussion. But I believe I read in your newsletters that the state of New York is looking very seriously at providing additional funding to MTA, which is Long Island Railroad, Metro North, and NYCTA, in replace of the federal, to replace the federal funding that may be going away. It probably is going away regardless of when. And the same thing is going on in Chicago. The RTA has recently put out a very large, well-done book on why transit is necessary beyond the usual standards we measured in the past. What Jim Derwinski has been saying is we need to rethink everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that what is probably going to develop is a complete change in the characteristics of the riding. And the future is fast, frequent service throughout the day. The coordination of pulse scheduling. That's where we relate the scheduling to CTA connections like in Evanston, or with Pace Suburban Bus in Harvey, and a major pulse connection that is to being developed down there between Pace Suburban Bus and the Metro Electric. Memorable timetables and consistent stopping patterns, and providing all-day transportation options for all types of regions. This is the basis of what Jim is thinking needs to happen. So I think we are going to see a completely different focus on what the measurements are. Yes, ridership is going to count, but I think the social values and the access and the equity questions are also becoming very apparent. And what we also found out about this is the number of minority communities that are in the suburbs. And these people are metro riders as well as suburban bus riders. So I think that covers the questions that you were asking me to address in your remarks. If
Yes.
not,
Thank
I
you.
will- Okay.
That's very encouraging, Norm. It really is. Chicago is one of my actually I would have to say Chicago is my favorite city. Even though I live close to New York, I love Chicago. And I spent my first week at Railway Age holed up in the Chicago office back in 1992, and I got to know the city a bit more and had some good experiences there.
Well, I don't know if you were aware of it or not, but on July 1st and 2nd, we're having NASCAR races on the streets of Chicago.
I know. I'm a big NASCAR fan. I should look for an excuse to come out.
I think you should. Isn't there an interview you need to do with Jim Derwinski or somebody else out here, or the Belt Railway people or something like that?
I could probably swing something.
But if in any event, the excitement is beginning to grow and the publicity is really beginning to grow, and they're having some events to get the kids involved and everything else.
And is Metro signed on with this and going to get people to the race and out?
Well, yes. I'm sure we are doing planning and trying to figure out, how many trains we need to run or not run. And I will tell you that there are huge crowds on the Burlington and West Line and Milwaukee North and UP North. Those are the lines that really tend to generate the traffic. We'll actually put 2 trains on one schedule, and the first train, when it fills up, will run express, and then there's a guy right behind
extras, yeah.
them. And we tend on the Burlington, we tend to run express trains that in from Downers Grove, and then we have another train right behind them in this type of service, and it's scheduled with the same type of outbound service, with expresses from Chicago nonstop to Downers Grove, and then a train right behind them that does all the local work.
I won't say this to Kevin Corbett, but what you guys are doing makes NJ Transit look downright boring.
But Norm, I think we'll have another Metro discussion probably in the next academic year, correct?
I think we will, and I know that. Let me silence my phone there. Jim really looks forward, and I think our discussions going forward are also going to include Mike Nolan, because I thought we had a very great presentation from the 2 of them previously.
Yeah, and Mike is actually he is taking over for Jim on the Commuter Rail Coalition for as the lead.
Yes.
Yeah, I've had I work with Mike on interviews, and things they're doing out on the South Shore is quite well. I use this word a lot. Impressive, very impressive.
Well, I think they're going to be opening the double track next May. They are. I was just out last couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago, and it's substantially done through Michigan City out as far as Dune Park. And there's a lot of work going on, putting in the bridges for the double track over in NS and CSX and the rest of that. So they're moving along. There have been some construction problems on the new line down on the old Monon corridor, but they're starting to put a lot of bridging in place and a lot of rest of the things. But that is, to think that $1.5 billion is being investment in an interurban railroad is just kind of mind-boggling.
And your whatever issue that was last year, Norm, that you contributed that piece on the history of interurbans in the Chicago region, and some of those descriptions, man, that was great reading. Thank you for doing that. Well, anytime you want to write something for us, please go right ahead.
That was a fun article to do, and you talked about when New Jersey Transit at Red Bank sits and they put the in the station and makes the conversion.
Yeah.
Outbound on the North Shore, you put the trolley poles up at about 35 miles an hour.
Okay.
I did it once.
On the fight did well. And it's not like a pantograph where you have this much space to work with, right? You've got to go right
Oh, exactly.
about this much space, right?
Yeah, not even that.
Mm.
But in any event, that was a remarkable railroad in terms of its operation.
Kind of makes you wonder, NASA says we'll get to the moon, we'll go back to the moon, we'll be having crews manned missions to the moon in 2027. Well, wait a minute, we already did that 50 years ago. Apollo program, why is it taking so long the second time around? Same thing, really, some of the technology, right?
Well, has any other questions come up, Brett, or not?
There's another metric question, Norm, but I don't, do you want to take a metric question or?
I'll try.
Okay. Greg Hanna asked, do you think all of this relationship between the freight railroads, specifically UP and Metro, will change with the UP transfer of train operations over to Metro? And I think this is our last question, and then we need to wrap.
No, I think that when it finally occurs, I think UP will be very happy, but they will continue to do the engineering work. They will continue to do the dispatching. And generally speaking, they've been doing a relatively decent job. Every once in a while, the West Line gets a little bit tied up, but stuff happens. So, but no, I don't think there's going to be any really fundamental change. I think it's in the interest of both railroads. With that, thank you for all attending and sticking with us here. We will be looking at some future programs and we'll be announcing them as soon as we get all the arrangements made. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bill.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you,
Enjoyed
Bill.
it.
Again. Thank you again, Bill.
Okay.
All right, everyone, have a nice week and we'll see you soon.